what we're talking today, now we've mentioned this earlier, but I wanted to give more of a focused lesson on this concept of having dynamic filters, right? It is certainly true that we can set up stored procedures, to give us data filtered by one thing or another. And one approach that has been done in the past is you let the client application actually look through and have a look at, okay, what is it we want to filter by? So I'll use this stored procedure versus some other stored procedure to return the data. But that gets very awkward, especially if you've got 5 or 6 different things you want to filter by when you pull the data. In that case, what are you supposed to do, right? Well, I want to use this one that have 16 different versions of the stored procedures for different combinations? No, right? So what we do is we have one super powerful stored procedure that will allow us then to just call it and then basically nullify. And we talked about this different tricks we can use, right? So we're just going to look at a little bit more full-fledged example of everything involved in doing this type of dynamic filtering. Okay, come on, got to get focus here. There we are. All right, so we got to figure out how the data is going to be filtered, okay? Obviously, we want to reduce the data set to just what it is you're focused on. I just want to see cars that are made by a certain company between certain years and so on and so forth, right? And, it's all part of doing a responsive, well-organized interface, okay? And the key thing then is to allow filters to be ignored or bypassed as well in terms of how we set up our stored procedure itself, right? So I'm going to use that company database just because we know it so well and it's very familiar. The only thing, it's the exception though, in that the primary key and foreign key that the relationship between the two tables is built on is a string, right? And more typically, in fact, almost always, we have a database generated primary key for our tables. But it's good to be aware of the exception like this because it's very easy to work with something like an integer identity later on. So it's probably not a bad thing that we're going to use this as our example, right? So the idea is we want to be able to select, okay, data, and we have mainly 3 different situations to think about, right? Foreign key lookups. Almost always, whenever you have a foreign key in a table, you usually end up filtering by it, right? Whether it's, as I said, cars, okay, and you have a foreign key for an individual car entity for the manufacturer and the model and so on and so forth, right? Those will tend to be foreign keys, so we present them in our drop-down list and you select it and then away you go. You want to filter by that, right? Text strings. Now here it gets a little interesting because, okay, you're looking for text. What we most commonly see put into practice is sort of a contains. You put in a few characters or a whole word and you look for records where that is contained somewhere inside of a text field, right? But sometimes you want specifically that it starts with the characters you're entering or ends with, right? Or is it an exact match? That could be a possibility, although that's much less useful in most cases, right? And then the third case is ranges of values. Now this could be dates, and we talked about that example the other day, or it could be numeric values, right? Cars that cost between this much and that much, for example, right? And so on and so forth. So those are our 3 main cases. We'll delve more into each one, okay? So for foreign key lookups, okay, this is a situation where, as I said, we usually have an integer identity or a big int or something like that. Maybe it could be a GUID, but we can have text values as well. The point is to get some sort of a flag value, a value that would never exist in the real data that we can then use as a flag to indicate that we don't want to filter by this after all, right? So we end up with something like at the bottom there in our where clause, the filter for our select statement, where the field actually matches our parameter, in which case we want to include it, or the parameter matches our flag value. And because we're using the OR keyword in logic, what happens with OR? If you've got 2 things you're comparing with an OR, if either one is true, the whole expression resolves to true, right? So that means, each and every record will be included in the output because this will always be true if it's the flag value. So essentially you've removed the filter, which is exactly what we're after, right? Okay, so just as a quick example then, using our employee table, right, where we actually have then the department table is related to it, Okay, we might want to filter by a given department. Now in this case, the department code is a 4-letter code, right? So we'll have our procedure where we pass in that 4-letter code. Good idea to make these null, because we don't always want to necessarily make them required, right? That way it's an optional parameter. We don't have to provide a value by giving it a default, even if our default is null, okay? So then, oh, look at that, set no count on. We talked about that the other day. What does that do for us again? What does it suppress? When we say, oh, I don't want to count, set no count on. I know you know the answer. What does it suppress? Those messages, right? Those messages about how many records are affected. Because we're getting the data anyway, we can just look and see what data we have. All right, anyway, skipping over that, I just want to tie that into our earlier discussion, but then we can take our parameter, okay? If it's null, then I'm going to set it to an empty string. Now, what am I doing this for? Well, to be honest with you, I'm kind of being overly cautious in how I'm showing you these can be written. It is true that, you know, you could get away with a little bit more direct code, and probably it'll work most of the time. But if you're building an application, a database, right, to work with any kind of client down the road, you have to be aware that not all clients pass information the same way. Some types of clients never will give you a null. It'll always be an empty string at the very least, right? So, you know, you have to be prepared to receive that. It might not be null, so you can't just test for one thing. So we often, you'll see, end up testing for both. Is it null, or maybe is it an empty string? Because a lot of apps, that's all they will give you, right? So then we have that where clause in our select down below, where if it is still an empty string, so if we got null, or if we got an empty string from the client application, that's fine too, right? Our second part of our or will always be true, and every record will be returned. Okay, now, searching for text in a string. We mentioned there's 4 different situations: contains, starts with, ends with, and so on. And really, it's all about what you're going to do in terms of wildcard characters, right? That's really all it comes down to. So if you want contains, we will concatenate or glue on that % symbol, which in SQL stands for any number of unknown characters, right, before and after the parameter. And then the key part is using the like keyword, right? Like, it does a comparison, okay? It will function as equal as well. So I just mention here that this field equals parameter, okay? Actually, you know, I've got an updated version of this PowerPoint that I forgot to grab. Anyway, let me go back again. You could also just say field like the parameter, right? And that would work as well as the equal. Okay, it'll give you the result if it's an exact match as well. Okay, now, just to maybe mention, we can build our stored procedure on the assumption, if we know that they always want a contains, we can do it exactly as shown here. Another thing to be aware of, though, is that depending on what the client wants, what you might end up doing is just set it up with field like the parameter. And that way, it's up to the client to decide. And often what you'll do is on the user interface, you'll see a group of radio buttons where they select one of the options. Do I want contains, starts with, ends with, or equal, exact match, right? And then the client would be responsible for adding the wildcard character to the parameter either at the beginning or at the end as required, right? Okay, all right. So how do we add a second filter when we already have one? The logical keyword we're looking for in this case is not or, it's and. Because we want to add filters together. You want to further and further narrow down the data you're receiving back, right? So that's what we do. So you'll see that here. So again, I'm going to look for null values, possibly, okay, making those default or optional parameters. And then I'll handle, okay, my flag values in searching for text inside the last name here. Again, I'll set up an empty string. That works okay. And then the where clause, we have our first test and the second test. Very rarely, it has been done, and I've had to do it for some clients, where they do actually want an or, right? But, you know, usually that doesn't accomplish much, in my opinion. You know, usually you're trying to narrow down the more and more filters that you add. Okay, right? So the parameters for each include default values, okay, and we're setting those up, right? We're just using empty strings in this case. The AND logic, okay, applies to all the filters, but we want to ensure that they will also work with the default values and so on. All right. Our third case, ranges of values. Now this could be, as I said, numeric or dates, okay? So we'll define our parameters as text values. Why? What if they're numeric? Why not just use numeric values? Well, you can, right? You can declare your variable, your parameter here, in the specific data type that matches the field. That is not wrong, right? But I'm showing you a way that is the most guaranteed safe approach, right? So what we're going to do is we're actually going to accept text input and then convert it to the appropriate data type later on, right? Again, just because some clients will only ever give you text, even if it looks like a number or a date, it's actually just being sent as text. Okay, so if the parameters are empty, we'll replace with the appropriate minimum or maximum value. And that's the trick, okay, for any range. Every data type, by default, always has a minimum and a maximum value, whether we're talking dates, okay, or anything else, right? So we'll cast or convert our parameters into a variable of the appropriate data type before we execute the actual select command. So the where clause will select, we use between with our two boundary values, right? So we're adding more and more filters here, right? We have our first two. Now we're searching the start date of the employee. When did they get hired or start work, right? So we'll have a low date and a high date. Okay, again, I'm using varchar 10 because we're going to go with the standard way of entering dates, the 4-digit year, dash 2-digit month, dash 2-digit day. That is actually the ANSI standard, international standard for date formats, right? I wish the whole world would do that. You know, way back, I was talking with Matthew earlier today about when I first learned programming, I learned with punch cards, right, and on a mainframe system. Back in those days, you never did dates any other way. One of the advantages of that system for writing your date is it's alphabetical as well. Just sort of alphabetically, it's also in chronological order. But anyway, that needs 10 characters. That's why I'm using a varchar 10, okay? So when we come down to the date portion now, again, if it's null or if I was given an empty string, okay, then maybe I was just given the maximum date. I wasn't given a start date. So I want all the history right up to just that end date, okay? So this would be null, so what I'm going to use? I'm using in my database table the date data type, right? Well, so just quickly look it up or use ChatGPT if you're too lazy and find out that the minimum and maximum values for a date data type in SQL Server are these here, right? So by using them, if I don't supply either a minimum or maximum date to filter by, well, it's going to use the minimum and maximum values that exist, and every record is guaranteed to be included in the output. So I've essentially removed the filter for date range by not supplying any values. If I just give a start date, then it'll use that instead of this minimum, and vice versa, right? So that's the trick there. So, of course, we actually want to cast them as the correct data type before we use them in the where clause, right? So we'll actually we'll use the declare keyword to create them as variables, okay, of the specific data type and cast them over. So then getting to the bottom of the screen, sorry, hard to read from the back of the room, but the start date would be between the minimum and maximum dates. Anybody see a problem or an issue with this approach? There's always more things to think about, aren't there? What if the client sends you the dates in the wrong order? What happens with the between keyword, okay, if the lower date is actually after, chronologically, the higher date, so to speak? What happens to the data that's output? Can anything match that? Sorry, the short answer is no, okay? So that's something further that you don't often have to think about, and maybe you will or maybe you won't, but it would be easy then to compare, right? Add that bit of code, make sure the dates are in the correct order, that the first date is before or at least the same as, okay, or maybe just check that it's not after the second date, and if they are, swap them, right, before you actually do your test. Okay. So we've talked about the theory of putting all those kinds of restrictions on the output of our query, okay, in all those three classifications. What was it going to look like when you get to actually building the client? And yes, we're about to do that, right? After the test next week, the rest of the course, we're all going to be focusing on using our standard stored procedures and creating client applications that work with them, right? So that's just I'd share with you, it's a bit of a look ahead of the kind of code that you're going to be writing. So this is written in C#, right? For any kind of a client using that object-oriented language, we have a method here returning what? Returning a list of objects. Remember, we're going to talk object-oriented as you've been learning in your other courses. So an employee is a class that we've defined. Guess what? It's going to have properties in that class to match basically the fields of our database table, right? Not surprisingly. So we'll return a list of those employee objects from this method. Notice we pass in parameters, look familiar, right? They're all strings, and they're all of our parameters to match our stored procedure. So I'll define a string with the name of the stored procedure. Now, we can just actually pass parameters other ways, but it's often when you have more than one or two, I like to create this collection of dynamic parameters, right? It's a little bit clearer to read your code, less chance of making boo-boos as well, and we all make boo-boos from time to time, right? So we'll add all these parameters to our collection, okay? And then we just call it to execute. So that DB object, we'll get to this in a couple weeks, but that's basically our database connection object. It has the connection string stored inside of it, right? So it can know how to log in and connect to the database. So execute a query that returns what? Employee. Objects based on the employee class, right? So we pass the name of the procedure, the parameters, and this is kind of a key thing. Command type, we tell it it's a stored procedure, right? And that way it will work properly. But the result that it produces, we do dot to list. And that will create a list of employee objects, right? As you see over here, that is what it gets returned. So there you go. Just whetting your appetite for the kind of code that's coming up soon to make use of our stored procedure we just talked about writing. What is the interface going to look like? Well, not surprising, okay? You'll probably have a drop-down list of departments to choose from, okay? A text box to type the characters you want to search for inside the last name. Start dates, minimum and maximum dates to pick, okay? And away you go. Click search, and then you'll get the result showing down below, right? So that's exactly what this is all about in terms of creating these single stored procedure with the dynamic ability to filter by multiple factors all at the same time. All right. Well, I will just end that recording. Control Shift F12.